White nationalists and counter-protesters gathered yesterday in Washington, D.C. on the one-year anniversary of deadly violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. The marches were mostly peaceful, with a few arrests reported. There were protests in Charlottesville as well. 4 people were arrested there. 1 police officer was attacked but wasn't seriously injured. Joining me now is Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller, host of Mornings on the Mall on WMAL Radio. Vince, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, Lauren.
Let's take a look at what President Trump tweeted ahead of Sunday's rallies. Quote, "The riots in Charlottesville a year ago resulted in senseless death and division. We must come together as a nation. I condemn all types of racism and acts of violence. Peace to all Americans." This is a different tune than a year ago. He received a lot of criticism for his comments where he said there were very fine people on both sides. So how do you think that reaction a year ago influenced his reaction this year?
I don't think there's any question he had it in mind, and he wanted to nip it in the bud before this thing even happened. Who knew what the event was actually going to be this weekend? The president couldn't even have predicted how it turned out. But I think he decided in this instance, he looks back, he probably sees that as a mistake, and he wanted to get ahead of it and say, look, racism's bad. And he was unequivocal about it. That's the right approach here.
I want to turn to a story that's also received a lot of attention in the last weeks. Let's take a look at the front page of today's Washington Post. It's right there. The headline is "New Sex Scandals Roiling the Vatican." This is a headline a little over a month after we first learned of sex abuse allegations against former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. How do you think the media are portraying and handling the coverage of this story?
I think by and large, the history of coverage of the Catholic Church is often included the press sort of with like a patronizing touch and go. They'll come in, they'll focus on it, and they'll leave. There's not a tremendous amount of affinity for what the Catholic Church has actually built and developed and the good things that it's done for the world. It's sort of an opportunity to sort of go after when it has a glaring black eye. In this case, the Church clearly does have a black eye. They're working on it. Pope Francis, I think, is working on it with some urgency and some fervency. But the media, by and large, I think kind of covers it as if there's a unique problem to the Catholic Church, when it's not true. So much of our culture has a bit of a rot to it that needs to be addressed. It just so happens the Catholic Church has standards, and when it fails to live up to it, the media, I think, places a heavier burden on the Church for failing in that way.
Do you think the Church is handling it effectively from a media perspective?
From a media perspective, no, probably not. I mean, because otherwise you'd have the Washington Post probably writing a much more glowing assessment of the Church's efforts to combat sex abuse. But I think the primary responsibility here of the Church is to focus on what's going on in-house and to worry about public relations considerations at the tail end of the things that they need to be concerned with.
Do you think we're seeing more transparency from the Church than we did in 2002? During those sex scandals? I
think seeking and obtaining the resignation of Cardinal McCarrick was quite a big statement by Pope Francis, and he continues to engage with high-ranking officials stepping down in the Catholic Church. That is a pretty big showing on the part of the Church, and specifically Pope Francis, that he takes this seriously, and it should send shockwaves throughout the Church and a signal that men of virtue are what's expected.
Thank you so much. Vince Coglianese, editorial director at the Daily Caller, host of Mornings on the Mall on WMAL Radio.
Thank you, Laura.